So I'm just going to quickly go through some information about the lymphatic system. So the lymphatic system is kind of similar to the circulatory system. That's why we talk about it in this chapter, because it has a network of vessels um, and other things connected throughout the whole body. The difference between this and the circulatory system that carries our blood and has blood vessels and uses the heart is it has different fluid that fills the vessels. It's called lymph, and it's made up of interstitial fluid, which is the fluid that basically fills all of the spaces between all of our different cells, so that they're not just empty, they're filled with a type of fluid. And the main thing that the lymphatic system is in charge of is making sure that our fluid stays balanced in the different parts of our body. So you might have noticed before, if you're standing on your feet for a really long time, sometimes your feet start to swell or your ankles are a little bit swollen at the end of the day. That's because the lymphatic system sometimes has a hard time keeping up with gravity, and it might take you just to have to sit down for a little bit to kind of the lymphatic system to kick in a little bit to fix that problem. So that's what the lymphatic system is for, to make sure that the fluid doesn't all just pool in our feet or our legs over time. So speaking of interstitial fluid, this is just talking a little bit more about that information. So anytime, basically using osmosis, if there's blood if there's water in the blood and there's less water in the tissues around it, basically osmosis will happen and water will can basically leave the bloodstream and go into the interstitial fluid and also go into the lymph. And it kind of just circulates through those three different things over and over and over again, depending on the concentration of water and substances that we have, like salt or things like that, in the blood or in the lymph or in the interstitial fluid. So now this picture is showing what I call a villi. So this is one little tiny kind of hair-like projection that's found in the intestinal wall, and it has in each of the villi, it has a lacteal, which is basically like a node, a projection of the lymphatic system, and also a capillary bed. So when we were talking in chapter 6 about where different macromolecules go into, we kind of talked about going into the lymphatic system or into the bloodstream. So if you remember that fat will go from the inside of the intestines and will go into the lacteal, which is the lymphatic system. And proteins and carbohydrates always go into the capillaries, which is the bloodstream. So you might remember kind of hearing about this in the last chapter, but now it might make a little bit more sense as to what this looks like. And it wants you to draw a picture of this, so you might have to pause and draw that before we move on. Another thing that we do with the lymphatic system is it makes something called lymphocytes, which are a type of white blood cell that specialize in making antibodies. They also make macrophages, which are also known as monocytes. And these are two really important white blood cells in fighting off infection. So if there's a bacteria or a virus that comes into your body and you're trying to get better from this, basically those two cells are really commonly used. So that's why sometimes when you go to the doctor, if you're feeling sick, they'll feel this node that's underneath your chin. If it's inflamed or swollen, that might mean that you have an infection, and they might think, okay, maybe you have strep throat, and they're going to do a swab of your the back of your throat to see if you have strep throat, and that's the infection that your body is fighting off. The reason for that is because these lymph nodes, which are basically all throughout your body, so you can see these are ones that are behind your jaw, but you also have ones in your neck, kind of in the back of your neck, also in your armpits, okay, in the chest area. So they get inflamed when they're producing more of these lymphocytes, and we would produce more of the lymphocytes when we're fighting off an infection. So that's why it gets inflamed when we're doing that. So that's kind of the second function. The first function was to fight off the first function wasn't to fight off anything. The first function was to make sure that we're remaining stable with our levels of fluid in all of our body. And then the second function is these white blood cells. So just another picture to show you guys kind of what these look like. So this is showing how the lymph vessels go throughout our entire body and where the lymph nodes are located. So just another kind of thing to remember about the lymphatic system. That is basically all we need to know about the lymphatic system, though. It's just it's two things that it equalizes our fluid and also makes sure that we have place where white blood cells can be stored.